diving into Clausewitz. It's always,
Oh.
well, it feels like opening a treasure chest. Military strategy. We're unlocking a pretty fascinating chapter, I think, this time around, arming the nation. And given, well, your experience in the military, we thought, this deep dive would be, it would be relevant.
Yeah.
It might even spark
Relevant.
some new ways of thinking about how we look at modern conflicts.
It's a topic that was really, really relevant back in Clausewitz's time. If we think about it, he was writing on war in the early 1800s, right after the Napoleonic Wars.
Right.
It was a period of time, a lot of change happening in warfare. Larger armies, you had the rise of conscription, militias were playing a bigger and bigger role. So Clausewitz, he was really grappling with how would these trends that we're seeing right now, how is this all going to shape the future of conflict?
So, okay, let's unpack this. You've got Clausewitz. He's observing these massive changes in warfare.
Right.
And then he stumbles upon this idea of a people's war.
Right.
It's essentially citizens just taking up arms. Was that common back then, or was that kind of a radical notion?
It was definitely something people were talking about. Yeah, it was definitely being debated.
Yeah.
But like you said, he saw potential in it. But what I think is really cool is how he approaches it. He doesn't just jump on the bandwagon, let's arm everybody. He approaches it like a strategist.
Right.
So he's really dissecting both the strengths and the limitations of this whole arming the nation approach.
Well, and that's what makes Clausewitz so brilliant. He doesn't really do simple answers.
Yeah.
He wants you to really understand the nuances.
Right.
So let's get into it. What did he see as the potential pluses, the advantages of a people's war?
Well, one of the first things that he points out is that arming the nation, it's not some isolated concept. It's part of a larger evolution. It's happening in warfare anyway. It's really a response to the changing nature of conflict itself.
Right.
So you have this idea that you can leverage your entire population, not just your professional army. That's a huge shift. Clausewitz recognized that a nation that could do that effectively, that would give them a substantial advantage.
So it's almost like a force multiplier in a way.
Yeah.
They're tapping into a resource that other nations may completely overlooking.
Exactly. And he even uses this really vivid metaphor to describe the impact of a people's war. He says it's like a slow, gradual heat.
Okay.
So it's not this like one decisive blow.
Right.
It's this sustained effort that just slowly wears down the enemy, their resources, their morale, just their will to even keep fighting.
There's powerful imagery there.
Yeah.
And you can almost feel that heat building,
Yeah.
the pressure mounting on the enemy.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are specific conditions where that slow burn strategy would be more effective.
Oh, for sure. Clausewitz highlights a couple of key factors. The first is the nature of the conflict. He says that arming the nation is going to be the most effective in a defensive war,
Okay.
particularly one fought on home soil, and that's where that idea of home field advantage really comes into play.
Yeah, knowing the terrain, having the support of the local population, I mean, it's a game changer.
Absolutely, and it feeds directly into his second point. It's the duration of the conflict. The longer a war drags on, the more effective this people's war can become. So think about it. You're a foreign army. You're stuck, bogged down in unfamiliar territory, and you're facing resistance. But it's not just from the regular army now. It's from the population itself, and that takes a toll.
It'd be like fighting a war on multiple fronts at that point, physically and psychologically.
Yeah.
So we've got that home turf advantage. You've got a longer war. What other elements contribute to how effective this type of strategy is?
Clausewitz also highlights geography. He says that a really large theater of war, especially one with diverse terrain, can significantly amplify the impact of a people's war. Because it gives those fighters who are citizens space to operate, they can disperse, and they can just make it incredibly difficult for an enemy to establish any control.
It's almost like, you're trying to hold sand in your fist.
Right.
The more you squeeze, the more slips through your fingers.
Exactly. And, it goes a little bit beyond the physical geography, too. There's also the human terrain. Clausewitz thought that national character was really important for this whole thing to work.
All right.
It's not just about handing somebody a musket or a rifle or whatever. It's about having a population that's actually willing to fight, that they have that tenacity, they have that resilience, and that can make all the difference.
So even back then, he recognized that war isn't just about physical strength. It's not even really about technological superiority.
Right.
There's this psychological component, this national spirit that can determine the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And he goes even further. He says that sometimes if a population doesn't have a lot of material wealth, that can actually be an advantage in this kind of war.
Now, that's interesting. Why would that be?
Well, he argues that people who are used to hardship, people who are used to just getting by with very few resources, they might be even more resilient,
Yeah.
even more determined to defend what little they do have.
They're already used to operating with less, tougher conditions.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be as demoralized, by the deprivations of war. They're already used to it.
You're not going to break their spirit as easily.
Exactly.
And I imagine their knowledge of the local area, being able to blend in, that'd make them really difficult to counter.
Oh, absolutely. And, he even uses the specific term, he calls them national levies,
Right.
to describe these citizen soldiers. And he makes it clear that they're not going to be as effective if they try to fight like a regular army.
Right.
Their strength is in their ability to harass, to disrupt, to just make life really, really difficult for the enemy.
More death by 1,000 cuts than one decisive blow.
Yeah, exactly. Clausewitz understood that these irregular forces they're fighting on familiar ground, they know every twist and turn in the road, every hidden path. They can use all of that to their advantage.
This is all incredibly insightful stuff.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that he was very careful to point out the strengths and the limitations.
Right.
So let's talk about the potential downsides to this approach.
Mm.
What did he see as the possible drawbacks?
Well, one of the biggest things that worried him was control.
Okay.
With this type of warfare, you have a real lack of control because you're not talking about professional soldiers
Right.
bound by military discipline. You're talking about citizens who are driven by patriotism, by anger, by fear.
Right.
And all those emotions can be really difficult to control.
And that can lead to unnecessary violence,
Yeah.
reprisals, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And that can really undermine the resistance. You can turn the local population against you if you're not careful.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. You want to unleash that fighting spirit,
Right.
but you also need to maintain a certain level of discipline,
Right.
strategic focus. How did Clausewitz think you could navigate that?
He thought the key was the relationship between the regular army and these irregular forces.
Okay.
He said the regular army should be there to support, to provide training, equipment, guidance, strategic guidance, but they shouldn't try to completely control these national levies.
So you're empowering them. You're not trying to turn them into clones of the regular army.
Exactly. And this is where you really see his understanding of psychology. He recognized that the effectiveness of these national levies comes from their unique character, their local knowledge, the fact that they are so connected to this fight. If you try to force them into some rigid military structure, it's just going to stifle all of that.
It's recognizing their strengths,
Yes.
even if they don't fit into the traditional mold.
Right.
But I imagine coordination between these very different fighting forces must be incredibly difficult. Did he have any specific recommendations on how to make that work?
Yeah, he really emphasized shared goals
Hmm.
and mutual understanding. The regular army needs to respect the capabilities and the limitations of these national levies. And these citizen fighters, they need to understand how what they're doing fits into the bigger picture.
So communication is key.
Yeah,
Coordination, and I imagine trust plays a huge role.
absolutely. It's hard to fight alongside somebody if you don't trust them, if you don't believe in them. Clausewitz knew that building trust, building a sense of shared purpose, that was going to be crucial.
This whole idea of arming the nation is fascinating. It's almost like he's looking into the future.
Yeah.
He's seeing the rise of guerrilla warfare,
Right.
unconventional tactics,
Yeah.
which really come to define a lot of modern conflicts.
Right. And that's what makes his work so relevant, even now, centuries later. Yeah, the tools of warfare, they've obviously evolved, but the fundamentals, the principles that he lays out, they still resonate, especially when we think about the conflicts we have today, where the lines between conventional and irregular warfare are getting blurrier all the time.
It's like you could almost see the future of warfare, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Today we're talking about cyber warfare, information operations, drone strikes, all these unconventional methods that kind of blend the lines between, traditional battlefields and just everyday life.
Right.
It's like the whole concept of a nation in arms has taken on a whole new meaning in the 21st century.
It's that old saying, everything old is new again, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, it's not about, citizens picking up muskets. It's about giving them the tools
Mhm.
and the knowledge to
Yeah.
navigate this whole new type of battlefield.
Exactly. When information itself can be a weapon, when a cyber attack can cripple a nation's infrastructure, that digital literacy, that's a crucial line of defense.
That's right.
It's about empowering people to be critical thinkers, to recognize propaganda, disinformation,
Yeah.
to protect themselves in the digital world.
It's really interesting, isn't it? We've gone from Clausewitz talking about, peasants defending their farmsteads to everyday people defending their digital lives.
Right.
It feels like a natural progression of his ideas, even if he couldn't have imagined the specifics.
Yeah. And it goes back to his main point. A nation's strength, it's not just about military power. It's about the spirit and the resilience of its people. And that's something that's timeless.
It really is. It applies no matter what the era of warfare.
Exactly.
It makes you think, if Clausewitz were here today, how would he look at this digital battlefield? Would he see a digitally armed citizenry as kind of like a 21st century version of those peasant armies that he studied?
It's a really interesting question. Imagine a world where coding skills are just as important as marksmanship. Or knowing how to spot a phishing attack is like knowing how to handle a rifle. It sounds crazy, but it's kind of a natural extension of his ideas about using the strengths of your entire population.
So we've shifted from a time where arming the nation meant handing out weapons, and now it's more about distributing knowledge, critical thinking, digital awareness.
Exactly. And it's not just about defense either. Imagine how a digitally savvy population could counter disinformation, expose propaganda, even shape the narrative of a conflict in ways that traditional militaries just can't.
That's a whole other dimension of warfare, isn't it? Where the front lines are kind of everywhere and nowhere.
Yep.
And every single citizen can either help or hurt.
Yeah. And that brings us right back to what Clausewitz said about national character and shared purpose. Because in this world of cyber warfare and information operations, that sense of unity, that willingness to work together, that's more important than ever.
It's a good reminder that even with all our technology, even in our hyper-connected world, it's still the human element that's the deciding factor.
Yeah.
Just like Clausewitz said all those years ago, victory comes down to the will to fight, the ability to adapt, and that unwavering belief in what you're fighting for.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Clausewitz might have been writing about the battles of the past, but what he understood about war, the human part of it, how important it is for a nation to be united, that's all still relevant today.
Well, this has been a really interesting look at Clausewitz's Arming the Nation. And for anyone who's ever wondered how a military theorist from the 1800s could still be so insightful today, well, this chapter is the perfect example.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about, especially for those who have served their country. His ideas about national resilience, how important it is to adapt to new ways of waging war, those are as important now as they were 200 years ago.
I completely agree. So until our next deep dive, everybody keep those minds engaged. Stay curious. And remember, the best way to be ready for the future is to understand the lessons of the past.